what a polygenic index does is basically take all of those little teeny effects and sum them into a single number. And that single number, I call it the FICO credit score of human
Okay.
biology,
Yep.
which is that it predicts your height or your how far you'll go in school or how neurotic you are or
So let
likely
me
to be
pause.
depressed.
Let me pause on this point, because the idea that your genetics going to determine your height, you're likely to inherit diseases, your eye color, any number of things, people probably pretty much have their minds around. It's a understood concept. The idea, though, that you could look at genetics and that can actually talk about how well you'll do in school, if you're going to end up making a lot of money, this is where some new thinking really starts coming into this. This is the other side of the equation that may have thought more about what nurture could have provided or other ways. Is that getting it kind
Yeah.
of right?
Yeah. I mean, some, it depends on what outcome you're talking about. So, height is between 80 and 90% in our genes in a modern society where
Okay.
there's not like massive famines all of a sudden and, other big environmental shocks. But something like how far you go in school is 40%. How the differences in the population in how far people go in school can be attributed only 40% to how much the variation in their genes.
Okay.
But for like cognitive ability, it's getting closer to height, like 75%. And for personalities, again, on the lower end, like around 20%. So, so different traits have different amounts that the genes are kind of driving the show. But the point of my book is that they need the environments in order to realize their effects. So to take an example, there's genetic variation in body mass index and how fat or thin we are.
Mm-hmm.
But in the early 20th century, everybody had to work really hard. We had a much less sedentary lifestyle, and there wasn't venti frappuccinos with 1,000 calories to choose from versus the cal salad at the local Starbucks. So the effects of the people's genes were kind of suppressed by the low calorie, high work environment. And now we live in the almost unlimited calories or choice of what to eat. And we have a more sedentary lifestyle, and those genes now matter. So the BMI polygenic index for body mass index predicts much better now than it did in the first half of the 20th century. So the environment matter. And then to take another example, women were largely blocked from higher education in the first half of the 20th century, and only in this last third of the 20th century did women have complete access to higher education, and now they exceed men in terms of the number of bachelor degrees they get. And if you look at the polygenic index for education, it did not predict for women very well. In those cohorts of women that grew up, let's say, before the 1960s, but it predicts much better now. So the environmental landscape matters, and that's because a lot of genes have to they're not akin to architects building specs. Like, you're going to make this person this tall, with this many stories and this many apartments, exactly laid out like this. Genes are more like an AI algorithm, a machine learning algorithm. It just says, we got this tool, let's call it a neural network or whatever. Go out and find some data in the world, and the data and it seeks out data. So the more you're exposed to the world, to the environment, the more the genes sort of come into focus and matter more. And that's because we sort into our environments.
If you were being asked, because I think part of this is where the surprise comes in, but if you're being asked of what things are you genetically predisposed to do that are surprising to people, that kind of gets at the root of this, because again, there's things we have understood for years, but I think the crux of what I find so interesting about your work is the things that really never occurred to you that would have been driven by your genetics. Give some examples, if you would, of what that is.
Well, I think you gave a couple examples earlier, like the things like how much money you make,
Hmm.
as an adult, or how far you go in school. I wouldn't use the term driven by your genetics, but there's definitely
Influenced.
influenced by your genetics. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not like eye color, which is almost 100% driven by your genetics. Yeah, but I'm surprised that people are surprised by that, because if you think about it and you break it down logically in your head, as I think you pointed out as well, nobody's that shocked that height has a genetic component, or that your immune system maybe has a genetic component, or any other kind of attribute that's about you physically might have a genetic component. But then the moment we get to brains, people all of a sudden think, oh, there's no genetic component. But I think they stop and think about it, and think about the fact that even if genes determine whether or not you're more or less likely to get ill. Like if you're unhealthy, you're not going to go as far in school generally. You're
Right.
not going to
Right.
do as well in the labor market. So there are a whole bunch of mechanisms by which genes affect those kind of things, like whether we're wealthy or we're poor, that have nothing to do with cognitive ability. Um, have There's many pathways. There's pathways through addictive behavior, for example. There's pathways through height and beauty that we know that beautiful people are more rewarded in the labor
That's
market.
right. Right.
It's not, I think when people stop and realize, oh yeah, all those things determine how far people go in the socioeconomic rat race. Then they'll be less sort of shocked that genes matter for those kind of social outcomes,
Okay.
socioeconomic outcomes.
The other thing that you brought in this idea is that this concept of the social genome, and you mentioned this a second ago, but that the DNA of the people around us shape and is part of our environment too.
Yeah.
Explain what you mean by that.
To me, that's one of the most sort of exciting parts of this.
Hmm.
Um, so it's kind of just a syllogism. The people around you, the important people in your life, your
Yep.
parents, your children, your peers in school when you're growing up, they matter to you. They matter to how you turn out, and their behavior, which is the relevant aspect of them that matters, it is partly driven by their genes. So we can actually study their genes and study how their genes predict through their behavior how you turn out. And so
Give me an example of that. Yeah.
one example of this that Romina Sotude from Yale University, my former student, and I worked on was peer influence of smoking. So we
Hmm.
looked at high schools in a nationally representative study, and people sort across high schools based on a lot of factors. So we didn't want to compare across high schools. We compared within a high school that this year's junior class had a certain distribution of smoking polygenic indices as compared to next year's junior class or last year's junior class. And we showed that if we're looking within a high school, the year-to-year variation in the distribution of genetic scores for smoking in a given class in a given grade is random. So we're treating that as kind of a random experiment. One kid happens to be in the junior class this year, and there's a handful of kids in that grade who have really high polygenic scores for smoking, and another kid in the same school is with the same polygenic index themselves for smoking, is in the next year's junior class, and there are really there may be just one student at the very high end of the smoking distribution for the genetic risk for smoking. And what we found was that those quote unquote bad apples with respect to the sort of genetics of smoking can affect an entire grade. So the grades that have those more kids who are at the extreme and very likely to take up smoking end
Hmm.
up creating a kind of contagious effect across the entire social network. And that even if I don't know those kids personally because I don't share the classes with them or they're not my friends, I'm more likely to smoke because of this social effect that started with like a spark from their genes.
Amazing.
And
Okay.
that effect is so big that it's almost as big as the genes of my own body determining whether I smoke or not.
Wow.